My name is Cole Reardon, and I have been hiking since I was 8 years old. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you what happened on the trail, because the word hiking does not fully capture the relationship I am describing. I did not hike recreationally. I did not hike for fitness or for Instagram or for the particular brand of wellness culture that discovered the outdoors sometime around 2015 and decided it was a personality. I hiked the way some people pray, with full attention, with the understanding that the thing I was doing was larger than me, with a respect for the environment I was moving through that I had been taught by my father and that he had been taught by his. I have covered over 4,000 miles of trail across 14 states. I have hiked in conditions that most people would consider dangerous and emerged from all of them with the calm competence of someone who knows their environment. I know what the woods sound like at night. I know what they feel like in different seasons, in different weather, in different moods. Because the woods have moods, anyone who has spent real time in them knows this. And learning to read those moods is most of what wilderness competence actually is. I am telling you this because what happened on the Appalachian Trail last October was not the product of inexperience or imagination or the ordinary fear of unfamiliar darkness. I know the difference between a forest that is simply wild and a forest that is wrong. What I walked into last October was wrong in a way I have no framework for, and I have spent 6 months trying to build one and have failed. And I am writing this down now because the failure itself is information that someone else might be able to use. There were 4 of us. Myself, my younger brother Danny, who is 26 and has been hiking with me since he could keep up. A friend named Rachel, who is a wilderness MTN and the most practically competent person I have ever shared a trail with. And a man named Greg Toussaint, who had joined our hiking group online 8 months before the trip, and who had done 2 previous shorter hikes with us without incident. Greg was 34, from Atlanta, a high school biology teacher with solid basic trail skills, and the particular enthusiasm of someone who came to serious hiking in his late 20s, and had not yet had an experience that tested the limits of that enthusiasm. I liked Greg. He was good company on long miles. I want to record that clearly because of what happened later, because later is complicated, and I want you to know who he was before later. We had planned a 10-day section of the AT through a stretch of southwestern Virginia and northwestern North Carolina that I had not previously hiked, covering approximately 90 miles of trail through terrain that the guide materials described as remote and strenuous, and that I had evaluated from topographic maps and recent trail reports as challenging, but well within our collective capability. We were properly equipped. We had checked the weather. We had filed our itinerary with 2 separate people outside the group. We did everything right. I want to be very clear about that. We did everything right, and it made no difference at all. The first 2 days were exactly what they should have been. Hard miles, good weather. The particular satisfaction of a body working at the edge of its comfortable capacity on terrain that rewards attention and punishes carelessness. The Virginia section of the AT in October is genuinely beautiful. The hardwoods at peak color, the ridge lines sharp against a sky that is a specific shade of blue that only exists at elevation in autumn. The air with that cold-edged clarity that makes everything feel more present than it does at lower altitude. Rachel set a good pace, and Danny complained about it cheerfully, and Greg took photographs of everything, and I walked and felt, for the first 2 days, exactly the way I always feel in the early miles of a long trip. Deeply, quietly content. We covered 22 miles in the first 2 days, made camp at a designated site that had a reliable water source and good shelter, ate well, slept well, woke to frost on the tent flies and the sound of wind moving through the canopy overhead. Everything was as it should be. I want you to hold that image. 4 people in a good camp on a cold October morning, coffee heating on a small stove, the woods around them gold and red and ordinary. Because what came after was so different from that image that I still find it difficult to connect them into a single continuous experience. The change happened on the morning of day 3. I noticed it before we broke camp, and I did not say anything, which is the first decision I would make differently if I could go back. We had camped about a mile south of a ridge, crossing at roughly 4,000 feet, and when I stepped out of my tent in the gray pre-dawn light to start water for breakfast, I noticed that the woods around the campsite were completely silent. Not quiet in the ordinary pre-dawn way, quiet in the way I described earlier, the kind of quiet that has weight, that is not the absence of sound, but the active removal of it. No wind, no birds. The October woods in Virginia at dawn are never silent. There are always birds, always the small sounds of a living forest going about its business. The silence that morning was total, and it was wrong, and I stood in it for a full minute before I went back inside my tent and started the stove and told myself it was early and the birds would start, and I was imagining the quality of the silence because I had been on trail for 2 days, and my senses were sharpened to a point where they sometimes produced false positives. The birds did not start. We broke camp in silence and started north on the trail, and the silence moved with us. Rachel noticed it first among the others. She fell back to walk beside me about an hour into the morning's miles and said quietly, without preamble, that it was very quiet. I said yes. She looked at me sideways with the specific expression of a wilderness empty it, assessing whether the person they are talking to is managing something they are not disclosing, and I said I had noticed it before we left camp. She said she had too. She said she had been watching the canopy for birds and had not seen a single one since she woke up, which in her experience of significant time in the eastern woodland was not a thing that happened outside of severe weather events, and we were not having a severe weather event. I agreed. We walked in the silence for another hour and did not talk about it again, and I could feel both of us managing the same awareness with the same disciplined quiet, the way experienced outdoors people manage things that don't have immediate explanations. You note them, you monitor them, you do not amplify them by discussing them too much until you have more information. Danny was ahead of us on the trail with Greg, and I watched Danny's posture from behind and could see that he felt it too, even if he had not said anything. He was walking differently than he had the previous 2 days, more carefully, with his head moving more, scanning the tree line in the way you scan when something in you has registered a threat that your conscious mind has not yet identified. We crossed the ridge at noon and descended into a valley that the trail map identified as roughly 4 miles long, wooded with a creek running through it and a designated campsite at the far end. The descent into the valley was where the quality of the environment changed from wrong to something I do not have a better word for than hostile. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you process as discomfort before you process it as information. The light was wrong in the valley. The afternoon should have given us good light through the canopy, the slanted golden light of October at lower altitude, but the valley was dim in a way that the canopy density did not fully account for, as though the light was being filtered through something additional that I could not identify. The air was colder than the altitude change warranted, and the silence, which had been oppressive on the ridge, became in the valley something that felt less like an absence and more like a presence, less like the woods being empty and more like the woods being very, very full of something that was not making sound because it had decided not to. Greg stopped walking at approximately 2 in the afternoon. We were roughly a mile into the valley, on a section of trail that ran along the eastern slope above the creek, and Greg simply stopped mid-stride as though he had walked into something invisible. He stood on the trail for a moment, and then he turned around, not toward us, but away from us, facing back the way we had come, and he stood there looking back up the slope we had descended. I came up beside him and asked if he was all right. He said yes. He said he had just felt something. I asked him to describe it, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said it felt like walking into a room where people had just been arguing. The specific atmospheric residue of conflict of something having gone wrong in a space recently, the feeling that pressed on you when you entered a place that held bad history. He said the feeling had hit him like a wall when we entered the valley. I did not tell him that I had felt the same thing at the ridge. I said we should keep moving and make camp before dark, and he nodded and we walked, and I stayed close to him for the rest of that afternoon's miles without explaining why. We found the campsite at the valley's far end and set up before dark with the efficient speed of people who have done it enough times that the routine is physical rather than thought. The site was a standard at-designated area, a flat cleared space, a bare box for food storage, a fire ring. It had been used recently, within the week I estimated from the ash in the fire ring. But whoever had used it had left one thing that stopped me when I found it. A tent stake driven into the ground at the edge of the cleared area, with a piece of cord tied to it, and tied to the cord, 6 feet away, another stake, and between the 2 stakes, hung at about shin height, a line of something that I crouched down to examine and identified, with a feeling I did not immediately translate into language, as a line of small bones. Small animal bones, carefully cleaned, threaded on a piece of wire, strung between the 2 stakes at the edge of the campsite, like a perimeter marker, or a warning, or something in between. I stood up and looked at the line of bones for a moment, and then I took a photograph, and I called Rachel over and showed her, and she crouched and looked at it without touching it and stood up and said we should take the bones down and did we want to relocate the camp. I said we should take the bones down and stay at the site because relocating meant camping in a non-designated area in a valley I already did not want to be in after dark, and a flat cleared space with a bear box was better than whatever we could find in the dimming light. We took the bones down. I put them in a bag and put the bag in the bear box. We made camp. The fire helped. It helped in the way fires always help in the dark and the cold, not by addressing whatever the problem was, but by providing a circle of warm light that the problem had to stay outside of, which is maybe the oldest human technology, and which I have never been more grateful for than I was that night in that valley. We ate and we talked, and the talking was more deliberate than usual, more animated. The particular social energy of 4 people who are using conversation to maintain a quality of normalcy against the pressure of an environment that is working against normalcy. None of us talked about the silence or the light or the bones. Greg talked about his students. Rachel told a long story about a wilderness rescue she had participated in the previous spring. Danny argued with me about the best route for the following day's miles. We were all doing it, and we all knew we were doing it, and no one said so. The fire burned down around 10, and we banked it and went to our tents, and I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the valley. And the valley was silent, and I did not sleep for a very long time. I do not know exactly what time it was when I heard it. Somewhere in the deep middle of the night, the hours that feel furthest from both the evening before and the morning ahead. I had finally been drifting, not fully asleep, but in the shallow, permeable state that passes for sleep when you are outside and alert. When the sound brought me fully awake with the specific immediacy of a sound that the sleeping brain recognizes as wrong before the waking brain has processed what it is. It was rhythmic, coming from the tree line on the north side of the campsite, the direction of the creek. Rhythmic and low, and not animal, by which I mean not any animal I have encountered in 14 states and 4,000 miles of trail, not the sound any animal I have knowledge of produces. It was more like a pattern than a sound, more like something being communicated than something being expressed. It repeated at consistent intervals, 3 beats close together, a pause, 3 beats, a pause. And it continued while I lay in my bag with every muscle still, and my brain running through its entire catalog of sounds and finding nothing to match it. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was denser than the silence before it, if that is possible, the silence of something that has said what it needed to say and is now waiting. I heard Danny unzip his tent. I unzipped mine. We met outside in the dark, two brothers standing in the cold between our tents. And Danny said he had heard it. And I said yes, and we stood in the dark listening to nothing. And neither of us said what it had sounded like, because neither of us had words that fit. Rachel came out of her tent 30 seconds later, and the three of us stood together and looked at the tree line. And the tree line was dark and still. Greg did not come out of his tent. I went to his tent and said his name quietly, and there was no response. And I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the October air. And then his tent rustled, and he said he was awake, and I asked if he had heard the sound, and there was a pause before he said yes. I asked if he was okay, and he said he was okay. He did not come out of the tent. The three of us stood outside for perhaps 15 more minutes, listening, and then we went back to our tents, because standing in the dark between them was not making us safer. And the cold was real and practical, even if some of the other things in the valley were not. I lay in my bag with my headlamp in my hand, and I did not drift again. The sound did not repeat. In the morning, Greg was changed. I noticed it the moment he came out of his tent, and Rachel's eyes went to me over his head when she saw it too. The quick glance of two people registering the same thing and deferring the conversation about it. He was not physically different. He was himself in every visible way. Same face, same movements, same voice when he said good morning. But the quality of his attention was different. He had been, throughout the trip to that point, an outward-facing person, engaged with the group, curious about the environment, responsive to conversation. That morning, he was inward-facing in a way that felt less like introversion and more like preoccupation, like something was using the majority of his attention from the inside, and the portion available for the external world had been significantly reduced. He ate breakfast without tasting it, or so it appeared from the mechanical way he did it. He packed his gear with a precision that was unlike his usual slightly disorganized efficiency. Careful, methodical, very slow, as though he were thinking about each item before he touched it. I asked him twice in the course of the morning how he was doing, and he said fine both times in a tone that meant he was not fine and did not want to discuss why. We left the valley campsite as early as we could get moving, and I pushed a pace that was faster than comfortable because I wanted to be out of that valley before anything else happened in it. The trail climbed out of the valley to the north through a section that the map showed as steep, and steep was fine. Steep was welcome. The harder the climb, the more certain I was that we were leaving. The silence came with us for the first mile of the climb, and then, gradually, in the way that a pressure releases, it began to lift. By the time we were 600 feet above the valley floor, I could hear wind in the upper canopy. By the time we crested the ridge, I could hear birds, the small, unremarkable sounds of a living forest going about its ordinary business. And the relief I felt at those sounds was so disproportionate to their ordinariness that it told me something about the depth of what had been wrong below. We stopped at the ridge for water and food, and no one said anything for a while. And then Rachel said she wanted to talk about last night, and Greg said he'd rather not. And his tone closed the conversation in a way that none of us pushed against. That night, we camped on a ridge site with open sky and the sounds of a normal forest, and I slept for 9 hours and woke up feeling something close to like myself. Over breakfast, I spoke quietly with Rachel, while Danny was on a water run and Greg was out of earshot. And we compared what we had each experienced in the valley, the quality of the silence, the light, the feeling of entering a space that did not want to be entered, the sound in the night. Rachel was precise and clinical about it, in the way she was precise and clinical about everything, describing each element in terms of sensory experience without editorializing about what it meant. She said she had been in a lot of wilderness environments, and she had experienced unsettling things before, terrain that felt exposed, weather that felt threatening, moments of genuine animal danger, but she had not experienced anything that felt less like an environmental condition and more like an intention. She used that word specifically, intention, as though what they had moved through was not a place with certain characteristics, but an agency with a specific purpose, and the purpose had been to communicate something. I asked her what she thought it had been trying to communicate. She said she thought it had been trying to communicate that we should leave. I said we did leave. She said yes, and looked at Greg across the campsite, and did not say the rest of what she was thinking. Greg asked to speak to me alone on the morning of day 5. We were breaking camp, and Danny and Rachel had gone ahead to the first water source to filter, and Greg came to me while I was rolling my tent and sat down on a log and waited for me to look at him. I looked at him. The inward quality was still there, that sense of significantly reduced presence. But there was something else now too, something around his eyes that was very close to fear, a specific fear of a person who has been alone with something for long enough that they are no longer certain they can manage it without help. He told me that he had not slept in the valley the previous night, that he had been awake through the whole night, that he had heard the sound from inside his tent and had not come out because he had not been able to make himself come out, by which he did not mean he had decided to stay in his tent, but that his body had not responded to his intention to unzip the tent, that there had been a gap between the decision and the ability to execute it that had lasted for the duration of the sound and for some time after it stopped. He said this carefully and watched my face to see how I received it. I received it carefully and asked him to continue. He said that after the sound stopped, he had lain in his tent and he had become aware of something at the edge of the campsite. Not something he saw. He was inside a tent in the dark and could not see the edge of the campsite. Something he was aware of in the way you're aware of a person standing behind you in an empty room, through some channel that is not the 5 senses, but that the 5 senses have learned to interpret through long experience of being in bodies that are sometimes in danger. He said the awareness had a direction north toward the creek where the sound had come from. He said it lasted for approximately 2 hours. He said that at some point it shifted. The awareness of something at the edge became the awareness of something closer, much closer, and that at this point he had felt something that he described, after a long pause in which he looked at the ground, as not fear exactly, but the thing underneath fear, the thing that fear is the manageable surface of, the thing that fear exists to process, so you don't have to encounter the raw material directly. He said he did not know what was close to his tent in the dark for those 2 hours. He said he did not know if he wanted to know. He said he was telling me because he needed someone else to know that it had happened, and because he had been alone with it for 24 hours, and the alone was becoming a problem. I told him I believed him. I said it plainly and immediately because it was true, and because the speed of saying it mattered. He needed to know. I was not going to manage him, was not going to apply the rational framework that would have been my default response to this account 6 months ago. I believed him because I had been lying 6 feet away in my own tent, and I had felt the shift he was describing, had felt the quality of the night change at some point in the deep middle of the darkness, had felt a new quality of attention settle over the campsite that was directional and close, and that I had not reported to anyone because I was the group leader and managing the group's fear level was part of my responsibility. And I had made the judgment call that processing it collectively in the dark at 2 a.m. would not help us. I told him this. He nodded slowly. He said he felt better knowing I had felt it too. I said we were going to cover the miles we needed to cover today and make camp early, and tomorrow we needed to talk as a group about whether we were going to continue the route or modify it. He said he thought they should modify it. He said it with the specific certainty of someone who has made a decision they are not going to revisit. The trail on day 5 took us through a section that the guide materials had described as passing through a gap between 2 peaks with an unnamed hollow on the western side. We reached the gap in the early afternoon, and the hollow below it on the western slope was visible from the trail, a deep indent in the mountain's face, heavily wooded, dark in the way that certain low enclosed spaces are dark even in full daylight. There was a side trail leading down into it, not a designated AT spur, but a faint track, the kind worn by repeated foot traffic rather than built by trail maintenance crews. I would not have paid much attention to it under ordinary circumstances. There are many such tracks on the AT, unofficial paths to water sources or viewpoints or primitive campsites. But Danny stopped at the junction of the main trail and the side track and stood there for a moment, and I came up beside him and I saw what had stopped him. The trees on either side of the side track's entrance were marked, not with trail blazes, with something else. Cuts in the bark, deliberate and numerous, arranged in patterns that were not random and were not any trail marking system I recognized. Both trees mirroring each other. The cuts were not fresh, but were not old either, several years I estimated. Whoever had made them carefully. The marks on the left tree and the marks on the right tree together formed something, the way the stones of an arch form something only when considered as a whole. Standing at the junction, looking at both trees simultaneously, I had the very strong impression that what they formed together was a word in a language I could not read that meant something like "do not enter," except that the meaning of "do not enter" I was receiving from those marks was not a cautionary instruction, but a statement of established fact. Not "you should not enter." You cannot. We moved past the junction without stopping, and none of us spoke about the marks until we had put a mile between ourselves and the hollow. And then Rachel asked if we had all seen them, and we all said yes, and she said she had photographed them, and she was going to send the photographs to a contact she had at a university folklore department when we had signal, because she wanted to know if they were documented. Danny said he did not think they were documented. I asked him why, and he said he did not know, that it was just a feeling, that the marks felt too specific to that place to be something that traveled. Greg said nothing. He had looked at the marks and walked past them with his eyes forward, and I had watched him do it and had seen the effort it took to keep his eyes forward. The specific muscular effort of a person choosing not to look at something because looking would cost them something they needed for later. We made camp early on a ridge site 2 miles past the hollow, and that evening, over dinner, we had the conversation I had been preparing for since morning. I laid it out plainly, what we had experienced over the past 3 days, what Greg had told me, what the modified route options were. We could continue on our planned route, which would take us back down into lower terrain, and potentially through additional sections of valley. We could cut east and exit at the nearest road crossing, which was approximately 12 miles away. Or we could push north on the ridge and add miles, but stay at elevation, avoiding the valley sections entirely. Rachel said she was for the ridge route or the exit, not the planned route. Danny said he wanted to hear what Greg thought before he decided. Greg put down his food and looked at the fire and said that he thought the trail did not want us on it anymore, and that he thought we should honor that. He said it in the level tone of a man reporting an observable fact, and no one at that fire argued with him, which told me something about how far we had all traveled from our starting assumptions in 5 days. We took the ridge route. The next 3 days were hard miles. The ridge was exposed, and the October weather turned on day 6, bringing wind and intermittent cold rain that made the footing on the rocky sections difficult, and the exposed parts genuinely unpleasant. We pushed through it with the focused efficiency of people who have a clear goal and a good reason for reaching it, covering more miles per day than we had planned, but covering them cleanly, without incident, in a forest that sounded and felt like a forest, that had birds and wind and the small sounds of animals going about their lives in the way animals do when nothing has displaced them. The contrast with the valley and the hollow was so complete that by day 7 I had begun to wonder, in the tentative way that the rational mind reasserts itself when the evidence for the irrational has moved outside of immediate sensory experience, whether we had given too much weight to an accumulation of unpleasant circumstances. Bad weather coming, wildlife displacement, an area with a history of human activity that had left unusual markings. I ran this possibility through my mind on the long miles, and it held together reasonably well as an explanation for most of what we had experienced. And on the morning of day 8, Danny showed me his map. He had been doing the navigation on the ridge route, adjusting our path as the terrain required, and he had been doing it well. Danny is a good navigator, and I trusted his route finding completely. But on the morning of day 8, he spread his map out on the ground of our campsite and showed me something that I've spent 6 months since trying to reconcile with everything I know about topography and GPS and the way trails are built. According to the map, and according to the GPS track he had been recording on his watch, we had not been traveling north on the ridge as planned. We had been traveling north initially, for the first day and a half of the ridge route. Then the track showed a gradual curve, slight enough that neither of us had felt it in our bodies, barely perceptible on the map. A long, slow bend to the west. And if you followed the track of where the bend was taking us and projected it forward, it brought us back down off the ridge in approximately 4 more miles of travel to the western slope, where the hollow was, where the marked trees were, where the side trail led down into the dark enclosed space that had felt, standing at its entrance, like a mouth. We had been curving toward it for 2 days without knowing. The trail had been bending us toward it so gradually that we had not felt the turn. I looked at the map for a long time. Then I looked at the terrain around us and took my own compass reading and confirmed Danny's navigation and stood up, said we were going to change direction immediately and take the most direct route to the nearest road crossing regardless of the terrain it required. And I said it with a steadiness that I was producing deliberately because the alternative to steadiness in that moment was something I did not have time for. Rachel looked at the GPS track on Danny's watch and said nothing. Greg did not look at the map. He was sitting a little apart from the group against a tree, and he had been sitting that way for increasing periods of the last 2 days. And when I told him we were changing direction, he nodded slowly and said that was good, and said it like someone agreeing with a decision whose outcome they had already understood for longer than the rest of us. I am going to tell you what happened to Greg on the last night, and I am going to tell it accurately because accuracy is the only thing I am still certain is available to me regarding any of this. We were 6 miles from the road crossing on the evening of day 8, and the light was going, and I had made the call to camp rather than push for the road in the dark on unfamiliar terrain with tired people. We were on a west-facing slope, not the western slope we had been bending toward, but a different section of western exposure, lower down, closer to where we needed to be. We made camp efficiently, and I took the watch rotation that covered midnight to 4 in the morning because I was not sleeping well, and it gave the others more rest. At 2:30, I was sitting outside the tents on a fallen log with my headlamp off, listening to the dark, when Greg's tent rustled and then went still. I watched it. It rustled again. Then the zipper moved, slowly, more slowly than people move zippers when they are going somewhere intentionally, more the speed of someone moving a zipper while trying not to wake the people around them. The tent door opened and Greg came out. He did not look at me. He was standing at the door of his tent, and he was looking west, down the slope, into the dark below us. He was standing in the way he had stood at the junction of the side trail on day 5, not frozen, not the posture of fear or paralysis, but the posture of a person who is listening to something very carefully. I said his name. He did not respond. I said it again, louder. Nothing. I stood up from the log, and I walked to him, and I put my hand on his arm and said his name directly into his ear, and he turned and looked at me, and his eyes were open and reflecting my headlamp, and he was entirely not there. Not asleep, not unconscious, something else, some third state I do not have a name for, the lights on and the house empty. I kept my hand on his arm. He was oriented west. He wanted to move west. I could feel it through his arm, not dramatically, not the straining of someone trying to break free, but the slow, steady pressure of something that was not Greg deciding to go down the slope, and Greg's body complying in the absence of Greg. I held his arm, and I called Rachel's name, and she was out of her tent in 15 seconds. And she saw his face, and she went to his other side, and together we held him. And the pressure of the westward lean did not stop for a long time, a very long time, longer than I want to tell you, because the length of it is the part that frightens me most in retrospect. Then it stopped, and Greg blinked, and he said, in a voice that was his voice, but thinner, like something had been using it and had returned it not quite fully inflated. He said he was cold. That was all. Just that he was cold. We put him back in his tent, and Rachel stayed outside it for the rest of the night, and I sat on the log until the light came, and I did not look west. We reached the road crossing at noon on day 9. We called a shuttle, came off trail, drove to the nearest town, got rooms, ate cooked food, sat in the particular stunned quiet of people who have come out of something they do not yet have language for. Greg went to the hospital that evening. Rachel made him go, gently and firmly, framing it as a responsible precaution after an unusual episode, and he agreed without argument, with the compliance of someone who does not have the energy to evaluate options and is grateful for someone else providing one. The hospital found nothing. He was physically unremarkable. He was himself, or close enough to himself that the doctors had no basis for anything other than a clean bill of physical health. He flew back to Atlanta the following day. I have spoken to him twice since then. He is quieter than he was. He went back to teaching. He is fine by the measures available to us, and I find that I check on him more often than I check on anyone else in my life, and I do not fully examine why. I have been back to that section of trail on a map more times than is probably healthy, tracing the route we took and the route we were being bent toward, and the location of the hollow on the western slope. I have looked at satellite imagery of the area, which shows dense canopy and nothing distinguishable beneath it. I have searched the academic literature for accounts of that specific region and found several passing references in folklore collections from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, accounts from local communities in southwestern Virginia that describe specific areas of the mountain terrain as places where the land had memory, where something old had established itself so deeply in the geography that the geography had begun to reflect it, to function in service of it, to reroute things that came too close back toward the center of it. These accounts used the language available to the people who recorded them, which was the language of folk belief and local superstition, and I am not equipped to evaluate that language on its own terms. What I can evaluate is whether the experiences it was describing match the experiences I had, and it matches closely enough that I have read those accounts many times and felt, each time, the specific discomfort of recognition. I do not know what is in that hollow. I do not know how long it has been there, or what it is, or what it wants with the people who wander into the section of trail that surrounds it. I know that it turned us. I know that it reached Greg in a way it did not fully reach the rest of us, and that the difference between Greg and the rest of us is something I have thought about at length without arriving at a clear conclusion. Whether it was something about him specifically, something about his position in the tent, something about the fact that he was awake and alone in the dark for the full duration of the first night when the sound came. I know that the AT through that section is still open to hikers, and that nothing on the official trail materials indicates any reason for caution beyond the standard strenuous terrain warnings. I know that every fall, hikers plan trips through that stretch and load their packs and drive to the trailheads with the anticipation that I had 9 days before I drove away from a road crossing and did not look back. I know that some of them will come in from the south and descend into the valley and camp in the site with the fire ring, and that some of those will hear the sound, and that some of them will feel the lean in the deep middle of the night. I know this, and I have done one thing with the knowledge, which is to write this account, which I acknowledge is not very much. But the alternative is knowing alone, and I have been knowing alone for 6 months, and the weight of it has a direction to it, a westward lean, and I would like to put some of it down. The Appalachian Trail is 2,190 miles long. It passes through 14 states and 115 national forest and park units, and more distinct ecological zones than most people encounter in a lifetime of travel. It is genuinely one of the remarkable things that exists in this country, and I have loved it with a serious, specific, informed love for 23 years. I'm going to keep hiking it. I'm going to hike it next spring and the spring after that, and for as long as my knees and my nerve hold out, because the alternative is letting one experience in one section redefine the whole relationship, and I am not willing to do that. But I am not going back to that section. I am not going into that valley. I am not standing at the junction of the main trail and the sidetrack and looking at the marks on those two trees and making the calculation again about whether the rational framework is adequate. I made that calculation and found out it wasn't, and the finding out cost me something I haven't fully accounted for yet. Some educations you only need once. Some places you only need to visit once to understand that they are not places in the sense you usually mean when you say the word. Not locations with characteristics and coordinates and measurable topographic features, but something else. Something that has been here longer than the trail and longer than the maps and longer than the people who made the marks on the trees. Something that has watched every hiker who has come through carrying their measured distances and their daily mileage goals and their carefully planned itineraries, and has been patient and has occasionally reached out and has always eventually gotten what he reached for. I got out. We all got out. I am deeply aware, in a way I was not before October, that getting out is not something you are owed by the wilderness. It is something the wilderness decides. And if you are lucky, the decision goes your way, and you drive to the nearest town and eat cooked food and sit in a bright room and feel the particular relief of someone who has been somewhere that had intentions for them and has come back without fulfilling those intentions. And you are grateful, and you do not go back.